Welcome to On the Other Hand. I love digging deep into religions and beliefs. Others' beliefs fascinate me, but I'm also constantly surprised about how much there is to learn and explore about my own faith. Something that recently has helped me gain a lot of useful and interesting insights was the channel centered on LDS Truth Claims, and is simply a collection of 35 presentations given about specific topics relating to the veracity of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now when I say 35 presentations, that comes out to about 35 hours of content, which is a lot. But when you're like me and enjoying listening to things on 2 times speed while folding laundry and doing other mindless chores, it's a little bit more manageable. But I wanted to put together some of the best hits from the series into one place, so that hopefully you might have a better idea if you'd be interested in this great deep dive. So this first clip goes over the idea of faith and the need for reason, as well as a summary for the series and the 3 basic claims that it will be focused on.
The argument does not create a conviction, lack of it destroys belief. What seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. Rational argument does not create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish. And so we're going to take this as the view of evidence and rationality that we'll presuppose for this class. And the reason is I don't really want to get into is this enough type arguments. That's a personal thing. Are you Kierkegaard, where again it should be irrational? Are you an evidentialist and nothing but what I can see and touch, right? If I'm not seeing Jesus and touching him, it's not enough for me. I don't think those are questions that like I said, reasonable people, very, very smart people disagree, and that's okay. So we're going to take the position that we want to use rationality as a way where our individual belief may flourish. So I'm not going to be concerned with proving things to a level that is tailored to every which person. We'll lay out the evidence and the inferences, talk about the criticisms, the assumptions that go into those, and again, for me, there's unbelievable amounts of rationality that gives room enough for belief to flourish in LDS Truth Claims, for me to be able to have an experience with God, for me to be able to give my life to something that is hard at times. But that's, of course, an individual thing. So we won't spend a ton of time saying, is it enough? Is it enough? Yeah.
When you talk about the truth claims, is there controversy like within the church about what you're saying, or is it like externally? Like, is there, when you give the right answer or various answers, is that controversial within the church?
It depends on which truth claim, but really the only truth claims that actually matter are 3, and we'll go through these. But it's really Joseph Smith got plates of metal that he had with him for some period of time. Those were, in some manner, turned into English, and there was receipt of divine authority by Joseph and Oliver Cowdery. Really, those are the truth claims that matter, and so it's interesting because we'll go through Enoch, we'll go some things that circumstantially prove Joseph to be a prophet, for example, or evidences for that. But the truth claims that matter are really those 3, and amongst the scholarship of the church and general church membership, there's not a lot of disagreement about those 3 things. Is there disagreement on the causes and justification for polygamy? Absolutely. Is there still disagreement on whether or not the priesthood ban was just out and out racism or was justified by God? Sure. Yeah. Even though church has now said it was just racism, there are pockets of people that, because they don't know, I think if you polled the people, there'd be some percentage that would be like, oh, it was divinely directed. So depending on the laity and what people understand, there are certainly, I think, still disagreements about like some of the criticisms. But in terms of really the only truth claims that matter, which is holding of plates, translation of those plates, and receipt of authority, no, there's really not. There's disagreements over when the Melchizedek priesthood was given. It's hard to date that, for example, but no. So just depends on the truth claim, but really ultimately the ones that matter are those 3. And Yeah, and then there's disagreements among others.
So in pursuit of those basic truth claims, this next clip I wanted to highlight comes from the 11th presentation. It comes in two parts that I've spliced together from that same presentation and goes over the topics of translations one can have, and how those translation assumptions affect our thoughts on the Book of Mormon.
What type of translation is the Book of Mormon? We're going to talk about three types of potential types: a literalist equivalence, a functional equivalence, or a conceptual equivalence. These are really important. So each of these terms describes a relationship between the target, right, the plate text, and the source language, with each indicating a greater distance between the two. So let's define these a little better. Literalist equivalence, what do we mean by that? This would closely adhere to the vocabulary and structure of the source language. It is essentially a word-for-word equivalence, understanding that there are times when syntax or semantics might require changes in the target language to retain sense. So this is what we call the literalist equivalence, right? It would be almost a word-for-word translation of plate text to English. Okay? Functional equivalence. This would adhere to the organization and the structures of the original, but is more flexible in the vocabulary. So it would allow the target language to use words that are not direct equivalents of the source words, but which attempt to preserve the intent of the source text. This is more in line with what we talked about being a freer translation, right? This would be a functionally equivalent translation. Finally is the furthest away from the source text, or conceptual equivalence. Now there's no longer attempts to preserve specific structures or vocabulary in favor of transmitting the sense of the source. It's still tied to the source, but tenuously. Fewer of the features of the original show through in the translation. This category allows additions to the plate text that may preserve the original intent while still providing wholly modern additions. So think about when Joseph said he translated the Bible. And remember when he said he translated the Bible, he produced the Book of Enoch, right? That was very much a conceptual equivalence view of translation, right? That wasn't tied. He was working off the King James Version of the Bible, which has 5 verses on Enoch, and he expands that to 110. So there was no sense in which he was taking that text, right, and translating it in either a literalist or even a functional equivalent. That was very much conceptual. He broadened, so his view of translation definitely included this concept of conceptual equivalence. So the most extreme version of conceptual theory of translation would make the plates extremely remote and essentially unrelated to the English text. It might even suggest that there was not really a translation, but simply a story based on real events. So those are the three potential types of translation that the Book of Mormon represents. So we're going to walk through the evidence. We want to be tied to the evidence in what we do. So what is the evidence for a literalist equivalence? Here's Emma talking about translation. When my husband was translating the Book of Mormon, I wrote a part of it. None of what we have exists in her handwriting, of course. That was lost. But as he dictated each sentence, word for word, and we came to proper names he could not pronounce or long words, he spelled them out. She provides an example. Even the word Sarah, she means Sariah, but in her recollection, Sarah, he could not pronounce it first, but I had to spell it, and I would pronounce it for him. So this type of spelling tells us Joseph read the words that he dictated, right? But it doesn't tell us how those words correlated to the plate text, right? So we're seeing words, but that doesn't tell us how they correlated to the plate text. So the strongest spelling-based case for a literal translation comes when we find unusual words, right? Since this category of spelled words may be an attempt to transliterate rather than to translate. I put this in here. Transliteration is when a translator takes a word in one language, adjusts it a little to make it look and sound more like another language, and then just puts it in there, right? So that's much more of a literalist idea there. So for example, in Helaman 115, Oliver Cowdery first wrote the name Coriantumr phonetically as Coriantumr with an ER, 2 M's and an ER, Coriantumr. He then crossed it out and wrote this spelling, right? So Joseph first dictates it phonetically. He says Coriantumr, and he writes it down, and then Joseph spells it like this, and that's definitely a non-standard spelling of the name. So Oliver wrote what he heard, then Joseph spelled out the name to preserve the non-standard spelling. Other examples where the text sometimes appears to preserve a word that was not translated. Kurlams and kumams, right? These are definitely animals, but there's no translation apparent. This also comes from a record, right, that wasn't in maybe the original Nephite language. So again, there's another layer of translation that we're dealing with here. Also, Nias and Shem in Mosiah 9:9 that seem to be grains, right? So we do have some examples of texts that come through like that. And then we have preservation of names that appear to have authentic connection to ancient Old World names. So, according to some critics, the Book of Mormon names were, the product of a schizophrenic mind that was excessively religious. They are in no sense divinely inspired. M.A. Spresny wrote in 1911, there is not a single discovery or scrap of evidence in support of any of the following names of heads under which the book has been divided. This altogether remarkable production of an over-imaginative mind bears evidences of the eagerness with which the would-be prophet sought to study his prophet, and how he, a little play on words, that was clever, and how he mistook his calling in life rather than anything in the way of support towards its claims. This is now demonstrably untrue. So there was a scholar of Near East, John Hopkins, that was responding to a letter from a critic that was designed to elicit negative comments. Albright, after expressing doubts that Joseph could have learned Egyptian, because of course Egyptian studies hadn't progressed very far by that time, he says, "It is all the more surprising that there are two Egyptian names, Panchi and Pahoran, which appear in the Book of Mormon in close connection with the reference to the original language being, quote, Reformed Egyptian." I put this in here because it has echoes of another non-believer that recognizes Joseph's ability to bring out Enochic texts. I do not for a moment believe that Joseph Smith was trying to mislead anyone. I accept the point of view of a Jewish friend of mine at the University of Utah that he was a religious genius. We've seen that word before, right? People calling him a religious genius for his ability to bring out Enoch examples that were not extant when he was writing them. So what Egyptian names do we have? We have Korihor, Panchi, Pachumeni, Gideonhi, I don't know how to pronounce these. Hebrew names. In recent years, a large number of ancient writings have been found in and around Israel. While many of these include names found in the Bible and other ancient texts that were previously unattested in written sources, some of these previously unattested names are unknown in the Bible, but are found in the Book of Mormon. This is really fun. This is where they're found on. This is a picture. These are like seals, right? That you'd use on a letter to say, this was sent from me. So, you can see some of them. You can Google them and find them online as well. So Sariah, known in the Book of Mormon as the name of Lehi's wife, appears on the papyri written by members of a Jewish community in Elephantine, Egypt, as a woman's name. First time we've seen it as a woman's name in the 5th century BC. It was discovered at the turn of the 20th century, and on several seals found in Israel that date from the time of Lehi. Alma was around for alma mater for a woman, but Alma for a man, it would look like this, right? Hebrew had no vowels, right? So they have marks where the vowels are. Appears on a Jewish document of the early 2nd century AD, also found in Israel. Other Nephite names attested in ancient Hebrew inscriptions, they do not appear in English Bibles. Most of them on these bullae that I showed you. Aha, Amaniha, Shemesh, Hagoth, Himni, Isabel, Jerem, Josh, Luram, Mathani, I don't even know how to pronounce that one, Mulakai, Sam. There's an up close look at one of those seals, one of those bullae. So what is the bottom line? At least 15 non-biblical Book of Mormon names are now attested in ancient Hebrew inscriptions, 14 of which date to before 587 BC. None of these were known or published in Joseph Smith's day. Many of these are in the hypocoristic form. That's a small form like Sam, a shorter form that was criticized as too modern when the Book of Mormon appeared, but can now be shown to be acceptable since it was known in ancient Israel from pre-exilic times. So most of our evidence for a literalist translation comes from this type of evidence, names. And the evidence comes from the fact that he spelled them out in dictating the Book of Mormon, and then they've been attested to in ancient times. Now, we talked about how many of the early saints believed in an inerrant view of the Book of Mormon, right? So they would say that the interpreters, that he couldn't move on unless the phrase or the sentence was written correctly. And we talked about how that was false, that there was lots of changes and errors made. After that early period, most scholars, and we'll talk about Joseph and Brigham Young, that the early view of inerrancy was very short-lived. And what's fascinating, what we'll get to, is the fact that it lives on in our day and age and is a kind of a huge stumbling block to some people and their belief in the Book of Mormon. So let's get to functional. What is the evidence for a functional or conceptual equivalence in type of translation? First, we have grammatical structure. So the Book of Mormon not only presents grammatical errors, but some of the errors are of a nature that would be difficult for the plate text author to make. What are some examples? We have mistakes in verb tense. So for example, 1 Nephi 15:13, in the 1830 edition, it said, "The Messiah hath manifested himself in the body." Right? From the verb tense, this worked from Joseph Smith's time period. That was changed to many generations after the Messiah shall be manifested in the body unto the children of men. The verb tense that would have been appropriate to the plate text author. 1 Nephi 19:13, "And as for those who are at Jerusalem, saith the prophet, they shall be scourged by all people, because they crucify the God of Israel and turn their hearts aside, rejecting the signs, wonders, and power of the glory of God of Israel." The original manuscript had the word crucified, right? Again, correct from the printer's, corrected in the printer's manuscript to crucify. So correct from Joseph Smith's point of view, but not from the plate text author's point of view. Thus, there was no self-correcting mechanism that controlled verb tense. Right? So there was nothing that stopped him from writing down the incorrect verb tense, dictating the incorrect verb tense. So the translation allowed for human error in the process and could create a translation that erred in ways that would not have been present in the underlying plate text. The nature of these errors also suggests Joseph's participation as a translator. Right? This is really key. Who translated this book? Joseph said, "I'm the translator." People that posit that he was a reader, that he read it off, they're saying someone else translated. Was it an angel? Was it God himself that just put these words to him? Joseph says he was a translator. We need to take him seriously about that. He wasn't just a reader. And that's what this type of evidence shows, that he was in fact translating. When we talk about Hebraisms in the plate text, this gets a lot of, I think in our culture, has gotten some more notoriety. People are aware of this a little bit. What do we mean by this? This is expressions which are ungrammatical in English, but are perfect Hebrew grammar. So instances of Hebraic expression found in an English text are called Hebraisms. The Book of Mormon does contain Hebraisms. Here's the problem. We don't know how to interpret that. There are possibly two sources, right? It's either a faithful retention of the plate text language and grammar, or it's influence of the King James translation, which we know it was written in that style of the King James version of the Bible, right? So some people have used it as evidence for the Book of Mormon. That would require more of a literalist interpretation, literalist translation, right? Because it's dealing with grammar. And here's some problems with that thesis. First of all, the plates aren't written in Hebrew, right? Mormon 9:33, "And if our plates had been sufficiently large, we should have written in Hebrew. But the Hebrew hath been altered by us also," right? So how do we find Hebraisms in a plate text that actually isn't written in Hebrew? That to me is a difficult question to answer. Also, Hebraisms are not consistent. So for an example, this is a Hebraism that's used often. In the original text of the Book of Mormon, we find a number of occurrences of a Hebrew-like conditional clause. So in English, we have conditional clauses like, "If you come, then I will come," with the "then" being optional, right? "If you come, I will come." That's probably, you can say that in English. In Hebrew, this same clause is expressed, "If you come, and I will come." Right? It's very odd English, but that's how it's expressed in Hebrew. And we do get that. We have that 14 times in the Book of Mormon, the non-standard English expression. However, we have 39 standard if-then expressions. Right? So what's the conclusion? The variability of the Hebraism, sometimes they appear 14 times, right? But if you were doing a literal translation of a Hebrew text, then they should consistently appear, which they do not. So those 39 times should also have that non-standard grammatical phrasing. So the variability of the Hebraism, sometimes they appear, sometimes they do not when they should, argues against a literalist equivalent of this type of plate text feature. Does that make sense? What else do we have? We have modern vocabulary and idiomatic expressions. Here's a favorite one, like a dumbass, Mosiah 12:4 and 5. Mesoamerica had no known asses nor any other beasts of burden. So the idiomatic phrase makes sense in Joseph's time, but had no referent in ancient America. It cannot be a literal translation of a plate text idiom using Mesoamerica as a plate text culture, right? They wouldn't have written that. That would have made no sense to them. Right, but it makes sense in Joseph's day. So it could have had a meaning like that, and Joseph used those words that make sense to him, but would have not made sense to ancient Mesoamericans. What other examples do we have? Fled from the presence of Alma and Amulek, even as a goat fleeth with her young from two lions, and thus they did flee from the presence of Alma and Amulek. Since neither lions nor goats were native to ancient Mesoamerica, this relationship between them would have been unavailable to generate the metaphor, right? So this wouldn't not have been a literalist equivalent. The other sheep of 3rd Nephi relies on New Testament context and cultural familiarity with herding sheep, right, which they didn't have. So Jesus must have communicated this information using culturally familiar imagery for his Nephi audience. Joseph's translation, however, preserves a language more familiar to a New Testament audience. Bible translators do this all the time. In fact, when they were translating the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of times when they come across biblical texts, they'll translate in the King James type English, Old English. And when they don't do that, they get complaints. And they had complaints that, would you please translate this in the King James? It's a version of English that people associate with Scripture. So this happens all the time in secular translations. Other things, I ought to not harrow up in my desires the firm decree of a just God. The harrow is a farm implement for leveling plowed ground. Neither that instrument nor the agricultural concept were part of the Mesoamerican agricultural world, right? They used little sticks and dropped seeds in it. They did not harrow. The underlying text did not require the translation of the word for the implement, only a word that communicated an emotion that in English could be represented to harrow, right? That would be a functional translation. What other things? We have the influence of the King James Version, jot or tittle. Tittle is a visual coding for vowels, a system developed after Lehi and his family left Jerusalem. Thus, tittle could not be a literal translation. The presence of this phrase is due to the KJV model of the Book of Mormon. What else? Mosiah 16:10. Even this mortal shall put on the immortality. This corruption shall be put on the incorruption. It shall be brought to stand before the bar of God to be judged of him. It borrows from 1 Corinthians. For this corruptible must put on the incorruption, and this mortal put on the immortality. The other examples, Alma 5:52, if you compare it to Matthew 3:10. Mormon's sermon on faith, hope, charity, Moroni 7. Several passages depend on the wording of 1 Corinthians. So the meaning of the language would have been on the plates. The form of the resulting translation cannot represent a literist translation of the plate text. This is my point. Many critical arguments, if not the vast majority of critical arguments against the Book of Mormon, assume an inerrant or a literalist equivalence, despite all evidence to the contrary. And despite prophets and scholars all rejecting this idea, they assume that. And in all 3 hours, I watched all three, there's a 3-hour interview, John DeLynn not once brings up questions, he had lots of questions, but not once says, why would you assume the Book of Mormon is inerrant or a literalist equivalence? And so I mentioned in that first session that we had, I said, at times I get frustrated with critics that claim to have read thousands of hours, and as this gentleman has. I looked forever and I sent these questions. I can't get these questions answered. And yet there's no understanding that they're familiar with any of the literature surrounding these issues. And that's what frustrates me looking in and saying, are they being genuine here? Because I see no interaction with, and that was my point there. Not to put people down, and everyone's going to do what they want to do. But if you come out in public and you publish things and you say, I'm an authority because I spent so much time and I just can't figure these things out, I would expect that you would at least be conversant with these and say, I reject a functional translation. I accept an inerrant literalist because, for example, The earliest saints believed that, and I believe what they believe, despite the fact that Joseph didn't and Brigham didn't and textual evidence doesn't. I believe that. Okay, if you want to say that, that is a rational argument, right? But to not even show that you're conversant with it is where I sometimes have a hard time. So this is directly from his document. What are the 1769 King James Version edition errors doing in the Book of Mormon? An ancient text, errors which are unique to the 17th, almost verbatim what he was saying, right? When the King James translators were translating KJV Bible, they would occasionally put in their own words in the text, right? Make it more readable, right? They were doing a functional translation at times, right? They weren't doing a literal translation, so they would italicize those. What are the 17th century italicized words during the Book of Mormon? Word for word. What does it say about the Book of Mormon being an ancient record? Book of Mormon includes mistranslated biblical passages that were later changed in Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible. Again, he's taking the view that the Joseph Smith translation, when he called it a translation, was also inerrant, and so they have to agree. And so lots of times Joseph provided different translations that were both useful and profitable, and they didn't agree. But he's really concerned with that, right? These Book of Mormon verses should match the inspired JST version instead of the incorrect KJV version that Joseph later fixed. So there's this view, it requires a view of inerrant and a literalist translation. And as soon as you don't posit that, these problems are just not problems at all. They're evidence of a functional translation. I agree with all of these, and how I'd answer them, it was a functional translation, and Joseph used the KJV model. So that's why it matters, because it goes to the assumptions that you carry into the argument. Let's take one example of this: horses. Right? Horses is often brought up as being anachronistic to the Book of Mormon. We have three possible approaches to deal with the fact that the word horses appears in the Book of Mormon. Number one, a literalist assumption. The word exactly captures the meaning on the plate text. Right? That's what the critics would look. Horses there. If we can't find a horse in Mesoamerica, the Book of Mormon itself is false. Okay. Number two, results of true translation. There's a few scholars that propose this idea that Nephites provided new names for animals that they don't know, imposing their terminology on the plate text, which carried through the target language. So if they see a deer, they call it a horse or whatever. Number three, Joseph used his own functional equivalent of the animal in the plate text. The English word is the result of Joseph's misapplication of the label rather than the Nephite's label. What's the evidence show us? What does the data support? Well, we've showed that there's no evidence for a literalist equivalent to labels that represent animals. We said that the closest we get for evidence there is about proper names for people, right? Because he would spell those out.
Oh, and the Kuam and Cummins, right?
Yeah, and like I said, so words that aren't even in English at all, and the grains, those two grains. So perhaps those features that kind of bleed through that aren't recognizable at all. So let's look at what the data says. Okay, so Alma 18:9. Behold, he is feeding thy horses. Now the king had commanded his servants that they should prepare his horses and chariots and conduct him forth to the land of Nephi. So what do we get from this? Horses and chariots are positioned near the palace, and horses must be fed, right? Does the text ever say that people ride horses? No. Or that horses pull chariots? No. Or that horses are used as beasts of burden or in a context of war? No and no. All the functions that you would think of as a horse doing, we do not get in the text. Horses and chariots appear in the context of a formal state visit. Another formal state visit. Lamoni caused that his servants should make ready his horses and his chariots for another state visit to the king of the land where they were held, Alma 20:6. Other place where we read of horses in 3rd Nephi when they're starting to move everywhere to prepare for the final battle. It came to pass in the 17th year, the proclamation of Laconius had gone forth throughout all the face of the land. They had taken their horses and their chariots and their cattle and all their flocks and their herds and their grain. And it goes on, and they take them all over, right? If you were to replace here, this to me always sounded like horses sound like more like food, right? I mean, in this context, right? They take their horses, their chariots, their cattle, their flocks, their herds, their grain. They're definitely possessions. So they're among the belongings that they're transporting with them. They seem reserved for special occasions or state visits. Again, they're never ridden. They never impact Nephite society in the same way as all other horseback societies, from nomadic Mongols as food, transport, valuable property, to sedentary farmers of Europe, plowing, riding, beasts of burden. We get nothing of that. If you were to replace horse with some random word, you wouldn't know. You know that it was an animal, but would you ever guess that it was a horse? You would not. Thus, the text does not require the particular word represented in the translation. So, for example, so again, you can go back and some people, some scholars, there have been horse remains and the dating is uncertain and they're still kind of debating that. Some Mormons take this view that, hey, they wore hearses and we're going to find them, and we found them, and now there's a dating debate. Some take this view that, they were misapplying labels and it got carried through. I would take this view that Joseph misapplied he was doing a functional translation and misapplied the name of some animal that was used in formal state visits, because again the data doesn't support the fact that it was a literalist translation of that word. So that's just one example. So what are the conclusions? There's some evidence that supports literalist equivalence in cases such as names and preservation of ancient names. There's no evidence that allows us to conclude that the translation of the Book of Mormon was in any way inerrant, or even that it resulted in the best possible expression of the plain text meaning, right? Because there's continuing changes, and Joseph was making changes before he died. So this requires a functional translation. Further evidence of a functional equivalence from grammar, modern idioms, and influence of the KJV. And there is some evidence for conceptual equivalence. We didn't get into that, but there are a few places where scholars argue for a broader conceptual equivalence, where there was a wholly modern, Joseph expanded the text like he did with the Book of Moses in his JST translation. So I'd argue with a number of scholars that the best way to identify characteristics of the Book of Mormon translation is to posit functional equivalence, unless a very specific, detailed textual analysis supports an argument that particular words or passages are either literalist or conceptual. And that's the most reasonable position to take. So as we move forward, this has, again, a lot to say about what kind of evidence we're looking for in the Book of Mormon to judge its historicity, right? If it's mainly a functionally equivalent translation of an ancient text, what kind of evidence are we going to view as appropriate? Grammar, for example, we will not rely on arguments from grammar, Hebraisms in particular, to argue that it's an ancient text, right? So what kind of evidence? Discovering the conditions and culture that were relevant at the time of a text creation should explicate the text in ways that the wrong production culture would not. We may expect that regardless of the relationship of the translator to the text, the mindset of the original authors of a document should come through. The ancient mind behind the text should show in the pressures to which the Book of Mormon peoples responded, the history which influenced their actions, and the culture which governed the nature of their responses. This is the kind of evidence that will place the text as a modern 19th century invention or as a translation of an ancient text. There are lots of different ways to read the Book of Mormon. We mainly read it in church as from a doctrinal perspective, right? I think that's the vast majority of classes I've been. We read it from a doctrinal perspective. We liken it to ourselves, right? What can this teach us about life and living? That's an awesome way to read it. There's other ways to read it. From a textual perspective, we are going to read it from a historical perspective. And so that's the process that we'll start next session, is we'll be looking at the text from a historical perspective, and we're trying to understand, is it reasonable to understand this as a translation of an ancient text from Mesoamerica, or not? And there should be these congruence of factors that we'll talk about, not simply lining up things that match. We'll talk about how there's been sloppy scholarship done by armchair scholars, well-meaning folks in the church that just simply line up similarities between the old world and the new world and call it evidence. We're going to be a little bit more rigorous and require correspondences that really, again, help understand the text in a way that a modern culture would not. So we're going to look for ways where the proposed culture in Mesoamerica will actually help us understand the text better, which I think is actually more fun. It provides more meaning to the text and is actually a really fun, interesting way to read it, rather than, again, lining up proposed similarities and go and look. So that's the reason why we're going to do it that way, because it's, as we've discussed, a functional translation, so it requires that level of analysis.
Speaking of assumptions within the Book of Mormon, this next section comes from presentation number 15, where Nephi and his record are discussed, along with the assumptions and purposes that were probably had in writing the scriptures the way they were written.
King Nephi, the most powerful cultural values are those that go without being said. Think about that for a second. It is very hard to know what goes without being said in another culture, but often we are not even aware of what goes without being said in our own culture. This is why misunderstanding and misinterpretation happen. When a passage of Scripture appears to leave out a piece of the puzzle because something went without being said, we instinctively fill in the gap with a piece from our own culture, usually a piece that goes without being said. When we miss what went without being said for them and substitute what goes without being said for us, we are at risk of misreading Scripture. I've always loved that quote. I've always loved that quote. This is from Top 5 Things I Hate About Nephi, an online blog. She's not a believer, but she used to be. Can I just say how very much I loathe Nephi? Have for ages. Actually, and this is how this happened. I was once shocked a Sunday school teacher in class when I made the suggestion that if I had been Nephi's sister, I'd probably want to kill him too. Who wouldn't? The man is pompous, self-absorbed, and not at all hesitant to share his deep self-love with anyone who will listen. We get a lot of Nephi telling us how good he is and how bad other people are. And what you can do is read into that unstated assumptions from our own culture without asking why he's doing what he is doing based on his culture. Nephi wrote his account to justify his right to rule in spite of not being the eldest brother. Right? In his culture, it went without being said that the eldest brother has the right to rule. He did so by interweaving references and allusions to the story of Joseph, son of Isaac, into his story, right? Joseph receives a dream revelation that he was to rule over his older brethren. Nephi received a revelation that he would be, quote, made a ruler and teacher over thy brethren. This revelation comes just before they return from Jerusalem, where they get the brass plates and provide proof that Lehi, and therefore Nephi, was a descendant of that very Joseph of Egypt, right? The incident of the bow shows Nephi leading the way in terms of physical survival of the family. At Bountiful, it's Nephi that receives the inspiration and directions how to build the ship. The only significant event Nephi relates about the ocean voyage, remember we talked about how they probably would have stopped all along the way, get water, provisions, but what does he only tell us? Only the time when God's mad, when his brothers are attempting to displace him as the family leader, right? He is very intent on justifying his right to rule. What's super interesting, some people pointed out, is that in light of the emphasis that Nephi placed on ruling over his brothers, that it never happened, right? They take off, although there is, some also have pointed out that there's some evidence that he was ascending prior to the division, so Zeniff said that Nephi's brothers were wroth with him when they had arrived in the promised land because they said that he had taken the ruling of the people out of their hands. They sought to kill him. So he might have started to ascend prior, but really quickly they take off, and he never actually rules over them in any significant way. So Nephi wrote to define himself as the king. The structure of ethnogenic texts required that he not only demonstrate his ascension to the rightful ruler, but to establish an ancient enemy. Right? He's following what all ethnogenic texts do.
So do you think he understood that this was a pattern and he needed to do it because the culture would respond well to that?
There's been a lot of writing about, not a lot, there's been a few people that have suggested that he was trained as a scribe while in Jerusalem. He certainly wrote a ton, right? If he wrote a couple of different volumes. So if he was trained as a scribe, yes. Others argue that it's so, that it's not, wouldn't necessarily have to be taught. That if you're just trying if you're trying to establish a new people, that's kind of a natural thing. But I think there's a lot of evidence that he was trained as a scribe early on and would have understood it. So all of this, I think, gives us context in understanding Jacob's early sermon. So Nephi and those who go with him, they left their initial settlements on the coastal region of Guatemala, and they traveled for many days before finding a location where they established themselves. This is from Sorensen. Where the party of Nephi settled was quite surely the valley of Guatemala, or as they named it, the land of Nephi. The continental divide runs right through the valley, present-day Guatemala City, at an elevation of about 5,000 feet. Water on one side flows eastward to the Caribbean, the other side to the Pacific. This is the largest and most productive valley in highland Guatemala. The climate is famous, spring-like and temperate, with only infrequent cold rains and squalls, a marvelous spot in which to settle. The river that drains the valley southwestward provides a pass between the mountains that would all but invite Nephi's party to come up as they moved along the lowlands in their flight. If you go to the model, you can actually see that you can follow that river, and you can see the Valley of Guatemala, and it's pretty. Here it is. So he proposes city of Nephi here. It's right. The archaeological site is right in the city of Guatemala. If you zoom in, you can see the archaeological site. All right, so here's Guatemala City. City of Guatemala. There's the archaeological site right there. And then you can actually pick up the river that he's talking about, and you can drill in. It's kind of fun, and you can see the river southward that goes right through, hooks up with that lake right there that you see, and then flows down through to the coast. So anyway, so if you get home, you can actually start in the city there, and then follow it, follow that river, so you can maybe see what they would have walked and ended up there. So Jacob is preaching this sermon, but as we recall, the text is selected by Nephi, right? Jacob says, "Wherefore I will read you the words of Isaiah, and they are the words which my brothers desired that I should speak unto you." Right? So the king is telling his first priest of the people, read this text to the people, preach on this. The hand-picked text for the sermon initially appears hard to understand. "Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I will lift up mine hand to the Gentiles, and set up my standard to the people, and they shall bring thy sons in their arms, and thy daughters shall be carried upon their shoulders. And kings shall be thy nursing fathers, and their queens thy nursing mothers. They shall bow down to thee with their faces towards the earth, and lick up the dust of thy feet, and thou shalt know that I am the Lord, for they shall not be ashamed that wait for me." So Jacob elaborates on these verses, right, and that's how we normally read them, right, as a reestablishment of Israel after its scattering. That he makes it apply to the future. Why preach about what we would consider is still future time when the Gentiles would be the instrument of saving the scattering of Israel? Right? You have this new community. King Nephi says, preach on this text. As we know, Nephi always likened all scriptures unto us, right? That they might be for our profit and learning. Jacob later in the sermon actually tells his community that he's preaching, designed for their welfare, and he reiterates that he intends this to be a message for the current people. Well, we know, if we understand that community included quote-unquote Gentiles, people that had joined them, that were natives, that were already living there, it makes a lot of sense. In addition to explaining the latter-day application of Isaiah's prophecy, Jacob's sermon can be read as addressing the question of how Lehite Israel is to relate to non-Lehite people in the Promised Land. The answer Jacob taught is that the non-Lehites may, if they so choose, join with the people of God in seeking to build up Zion, as in joint inheritors of the land. Once they do so, they are numbered with Lehi's seed. We, as part of this sermon, read, "Wherefore they that fight against Zion and the covenant people of the Lord shall lick upon the dust of their feet, and the people of the Lord shall not be ashamed." Nephi's already said that he's concerned with quote-unquote Lamanites, right? People trying to destroy them. Jacob identifies the Gentiles as allies of Israel and their means of redemption, giving the community this vision of itself as a salvation of Israel's blessing provides a compelling reason for his sermon. Right? It wasn't just for us, it was for his people at that time as well.
So a little bit of recruitment.
Yeah, and they don't. How do we interact, right? We have the early Christian church had that with Paul. Do we baptize Gentiles, right? You have this exclusive view of yourself. That these people that have followed along, right? So it gives both of them comfort, right? It probably helps maybe some tension that was brewing there. Some have wondered why, if other people were present in the land during the Book of Mormon times, they are not mentioned more frequently in the record. This teaching delivered by the Nephites' first priest would be foundational for later Nephite prophets, and would likely have set a precedent for viewing all other peoples in the land ideally in covenant terms. Previous cultural identity from the Lehite perspective would be swallowed up in this frame of reference. An example of this can be seen in the case of Nephi's righteous brother Sam. Lehi, who blessed all of his children, what's interesting is you go and read it, Nephi does not say what Lehi blessed him with. He mentions all the other brothers' blessings, gives us some detail there, nothing on what his blessing was. And not, you know why. Anyway, that was a side note. Lehi, who blessed all his children, uses the term numbered only in Sam's blessing. Interestingly, when Lehite tribal designation are mentioned, there is no tribe of Sam in Jacob 1 or 4th Nephi. Why? Apparently because one who is numbered with the people, one takes upon himself the name and identity of that people. Gentiles once numbered with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and Aaron, or Lehi, are thereafter identified with their covenant fathers, without respect to biological origin. From then on, they are simply Israel. Right? So if you take that view that this is what the first Nephite prophet states, then it makes sense why all others are Lamanites, right? And everyone that joins with us are Nephites, because now they're talking in covenant terms. So this foundational text sets the bounds of their community and their culture. Therefore, the identification of the Gentile population of the New World as part of the Nephite occurs when they join with the Nephites, who represent Israel. Similarly, those Gentiles who mix with the lineage of the Lamanites are also absorbed into that quote-unquote lineage of Israel. All right, more rule setting, the Nephite egalitarian ideal. And it came to pass that I should be their king. Nephi tells us they want him to be their king. It kind of comes out of nowhere. Mesoamerican kings have been noted as early as the pre-classic, and monarchies are typical of the late pre-classic, 400 BC to AD 250. From Daniel Webster, The Fall of Ancient Maya. Prior to about 650 BC, we can detect no signs of particular social or political complexity in the archaeological remains of these early settlers. Although obsidian and other objects imported from highland to lowland show that scattered populations were by no means isolated from one another. At various highland centers, elaborate burials, large buildings, stone stela, and what might be early glyphs and numerals all appear by about 400 BC. So between those two periods, we get the rise of kingship and more social and political complexity. Some archaeologists believe that the basic ideological and iconographic conventions of kingship originated in highland centers, such as Kamloops. This is what Sorensen proposes as actually the city of Nephi, as archaeological remains, although it existed prior to Nephi getting there. By the late middle pre-classic period, 6 to 400 BC, kingcraft had evolved to the point where pyramidal structures up to 18 meters high were constructed at all of these places. So we know that Nephi did not suggest the title of king, right? He actually specifically says he doesn't want to be, right? And he also specifically tells us that he didn't teach much of the old world culture to his people. Right? In 2 Nephi 25:6, but behold, I, Nephi, have not taught my children after the manner of the Jews. But behold, I of myself have dwelled at Jerusalem, wherefore I know concerning the regions round about. Right? He didn't explicitly, this goes to the point of importing culture, they were receivers of culture. He explicitly didn't teach them a lot of what he knew of the culture of where he came from. So the idea is not that this came from them, this came from the surrounding area. This is a time when we know archaeologically that kingships were being established, so it makes perfect sense that they would be wanting a king at about this time. Therefore, the desire for a king reflected a surge in the rise of kings all around the city of Nephi at that time period. Although it appears early, so like if you saw that time frame, you certainly see it by 400 BC. It is probably only because we have the textual information for it, for its beginning, rather than being required to wait for the monumental architecture that provide the archaeological evidence for the kingship, right? So we have this glimpse into this happening textually, where the archaeologists aren't seeing the result of it with these structures and everything until 400 BC. So it's really cool. We're seeing this textually rather than archaeologically. So just stepping back for a moment to end here, there are 5 major sections in 2nd Nephi. Lehi's blessing of his sons, a historical chapter about the division of Nephites and Lamanites, which we've talked about. Jacob's sermon on the salvation of Israel by Gentiles, which we've talked about. Then we get extensive quotations from Isaiah, and finally Nephi's concluding prophetic vision. Now some people take these extensive quotations from Isaiah quite critically. Sandra and Gerald Tanner say that Joseph had to have some filler because he lost 116 pages, so he threw in some Isaiah. But when you actually read it, it makes a lot of sense. The Isaiah quotations that Nephi selected form the basis for his prophetic blessing, and they reiterate the social and economic principles characterizing Yahweh's people. Isaiah emphasizes that those who seek wealth and ignore the poor are departing from Yahweh's ways in 2 Nephi 15. Adopting Isaiah's commentary as a charter for a community puts egalitarianism as a foundational principle. Nephi establishes an ideal with which Nephite society struggles throughout the Book of Mormon. And we'll see that, right? The struggle between social status and standing and wealth. They struggle with this ideal throughout the rest of their community's life. And it makes sense. This is what he set up as what they should strive for. So, let's end. What are our conclusions? Nephi writes for specific purposes, not to just say how cool he is. The overarching function of 1st Nephi is ethnogenesis, not history. We saw how he created ethnogenesis by following a pattern that was culturally ingrained. He provided his people with an accepted mythos for a new people. In doing so, Nephi wrote his account to justify his right to rule in spite of not being the eldest brother. The subtext of 2nd Nephi is then the principles upon which the community should be ruled. Right? So the 1st Nephi establishes the community, creates their story through an accepted pattern, and establishes his right to rule. 2nd Nephi then is how will this community function? Nephi instructed Jacob to give a conciliatory sermon that would help the Old World Nephites rethink the role of the Gentiles in their midst, and allow the Gentiles to see themselves as saviors of lineal Israelites and as recipients of Israel's blessings. And Nephi establishes an egalitarian ideal via Isaiah that will form the basis of most economic and social tension for the community throughout the rest of the story. And that's it. 10 minutes early tonight.
So you're saying that a lot of this was just setting it up. He had to build a new people, build a new kingdom, write the charter for the town, get it rolling.
Yeah, that's what he says, right? Because he says, this is my ministry. This book is about my ministry. And so that's what he has to do. What is his ministry? It's forming this new branch of Israel that he's creating. And so he does that in 1st Nephi through that story, following the accepted, again, unstated assumptions of how you do that through ethnogenic texts. And then 2nd Nephi is, all right, what's the rules here? Now that we've established that I'm the rightful king and that we're this new people, how will this work? Because we're amongst Gentiles, how are we interacting with them, creating us and them, and then how are we going to handle our society through egalitarianism?
Is there a pretty reasonable parallel for the restoration? So you have the persecution, you have the first division, you have all these kind of, not exactly the same, but similar types of things happening that kind of establish a people and give them cohesion?
Well, think about how we tell our story. We do a lot of ethnogenesis, right? We talk about coming over the plains and the hardship, and what's the cult change? Well, we have the first vision in the Book of Mormon. So every new people, right? And then we come over and establish in Zion and in Utah. So yes, every people, we do our ethnogenesis all the time. American society does it, with founding fathers, and we tell that story, and we do it as a religious people, same as they did.
Well, and we do it as a family. You kids growing up, how we met.
Yeah.
I mean, it carries on.
Yeah, it's not as you didn't kill anyone to marry.
We did not.
Marry.
Did we get that on?
We need some more primordial deep issue. Is my point. More primordial deep crossings.
But I mean.
But yes, ethnogenesis is done in small and large
settings.
settings.
Small and large, yeah, it's interesting.
Well, and I think a lot of times we think of the Book of Mormon as purely like Nephi's journal, instead of it has a purpose that he was writing it for. It's not just like his personal document.
That's the point. He comes across as kind of like if it was his like personal thing, like I mentioned in summer, like he mentions his wife like once, and it's because she's crying on the boat one time, right? So we learn nothing about Nephi as a father, nothing about Nephi as a husband, and his relationship with his brothers is shown as kind of, he's always telling them, repent, you suck, and I'm really great, right? So if you view it as his journal, he comes off as a bad guy, or pompous, not bad, but pompous and arrogant and self-absorbed, right?
One that his sister would want to
Yeah. So that's what. So if you read it as that, you can see how you get the wrong. If you're reading it with those cultural assumptions, if you read it with cultural assumptions of his people at that time period, then it does make sense. There's a method to it.
This next section comes from Presentation 29, when all the topics covered are summarized in one place. There are some more topics covered after this presentation, but this gives a great overview of all the topics that you could learn about if you went through and listened to the subject presentations.
So last part of this section, I wanted to summarize the positive case for LDS Truth Claims. Recall we started 28 sessions ago by posing our standard of proof or for evidence that we would accept. We talked about how we would not require, beyond a benefit of the doubt, that we were talking about a reasonableness standard, that evidence, rational argumentation provides room for faith to grow and for a unique experience with God, but cannot necessarily compel us intellectually to a belief. So with that, we went through first the direct evidence, so evidence from observation. These are people that you would put on a witness stand and you would ask, what did you see? What did you hear? This is what we call direct evidence. We talked about 14 at least that we know of, what we call informal witnesses that claimed that they felt the plates either between a sheet or usually under a sheet, or were shown the plates by angels. So some were natural witnesses, some were supernatural witnesses. We talked about the fact that many non-converts and non-friends tried to steal or bargain for the plates. We use this as evidence that in the earliest days, everyone believed Joseph Smith had plates. It was not till much later when critics started to say that he never in fact had them. We then talked about Martin Harris. We went through a session on him. We decided that his half-century-long testimony of the angel and plates is reliable. It can be relied upon. We then went through Oliver Cowdery's testimony of the angel and plates, as well as his receipt of divine authority and 3 separate visions. We talked about how those were reliable despite alienation from the church and from Joseph. We talked about David Whitner's testimony of the angel and plates as being reliable. We talked about the 8 witnesses, the natural witnesses that testified of seeing, lifting, and inspecting the plates, and their testimonies being reliable. We mentioned that there is no direct evidence against the proposed fact that Joseph Smith possessed plates of ancient design and received divine authority. Right? Direct evidence against that fact would be somebody seeing his smelting operation in Palmyra. He's creating thin plates of whatsoever. Right? Direct evidence would be someone lifting up, trying to get to where Joseph had them and lifting them up, and there is something else there, something fake there. We don't have direct evidence against that fact. We then moved into circumstantial evidence from purported books of Scripture, right? Joseph Smith that purported to deliver books of Scripture. These require a further inference, right, to support the LDS Truth Claim, right? So direct evidence, witnesses, and circumstantial evidence, the original and printer's manuscript, corroborated Joseph's Book of Mormon origin story, right? Then the inference that needs to be made from this fact, right? All these others, if you take them, they are direct evidence for the proposition. The inference that has to be made here, right, is that because he was telling the truth about its origin story, the fact that he dictated it with his head down in a hat for however long he did without manuscripts, is evidence that he in fact was translating by the gift and power of God as he claimed. Right? That's the further inference that has to be made. That's why this is circumstantial evidence. We then talked about how critical theories of the Book of Mormon origins lack evidence. They don't have any evidence when they propose that he used, XYZ 5,000 different documents, and they contradict each other in why he did it, how he did it, and who participated in it. Right? So we went through a whole session on that. We talked about how evidence is strong for a literal equivalence translation of Book of Mormon names, right? Because he would spell those names out. And then we said that there was at least 15 non-biblical Book of Mormon names that we are now attested we find in ancient Hebrew inscriptions. 14 of which date before the supposed leaving of these people from Jerusalem. None of these names were known or published in Joseph Smith's day. The Book of Mormon also contains 4 authentic Egyptian names. We argued that there was no naturalistic explanation that can reasonably account for these correspondences. Right? What's a naturalistic explanation? He found a book with these 15 non-biblical names, but it said these are ancient Hebrew names, and he said, great, I'm going to put them into my manuscript and hope that one day people find evidence for that. We don't find a naturalistic explanation that can reasonably account for how that happened. The beginning of the Book of Mormon is consistent, we argued, with the culture and situation in Jerusalem in about 600 BC. It fits in the context and leads to the following. We talked about the migration from the northern kingdom of Lehi's ancestors to the land of inheritance. We talked about how that was separate from his home in Jerusalem. We talked about how Nephi was actually writing and during one of the 3 peak times of Egyptian influence in Jerusalem. Right, so it fits the cultural context. We talked about Lehi as being one of many documented prophets sent to Jerusalem. We have documentation of other prophets, and he would have been another one of those non-mentioned in the Bible. We talked about the similar belief that Jerusalem could not be destroyed held by people in Lehi's party as people in Jerusalem. We talked about Lehi preaching against some of Josiah's reforms, specifically the removal of the original temple tradition, teaching the atoning Messiah, and how that gelled with what we know was going on at the time. We talked about Nephi understanding the tree as being a woman due to his understanding of Asherah worship. Right? Asherah being the goddess of the Canaanite goddess that was worshipped in ancient Israel alongside Yahweh. So he was fully aware of Yahweh or Asherah worship, and so when he shows him a tree and says, "Oh, it's Mary," it makes perfect sense to him. We quoted Old Testament scholars talking about how the tree of life is an ancient wisdom symbolism intact and almost certainly as it was in 600 BC. Lehi's vision of the iron rod guiding the people to the great tree was using the older and probably original understanding of that word. We talked about complaints of corruption and removal of scripture that happened at that time, just as Lehi's party is complaining about that. We talked about the Melchizedek priesthood being extant in 600 BC. They obviously claim authority to the Melchizedek priesthood, not the Levitical priesthood. And Lehi is a fleeing prophet and how that would have happened. We argued that there was, again, no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences between the start of the Book of Mormon and the actual situation in 600 BC Jerusalem. We next moved to the Book of Mormon part covering the Lehite exodus into Arabia, and we showed that it was consistent in geography and culture in at least the following ways, with Lehi offering sacrifices measured against the biblical law. The frankincense trail, we talked about how specifically that goes from Dhofar, the ancient source of frankincense, to all the way to near Jerusalem. We talked about the trail conforming in detail to Joseph Smith's account of distances, turns, and specific geography on that trail. The maintenance and working of bows and arrows in different climates and different regions. Nahum is a name and date and place, right? All three, a name, date, and place, and a turn on the ancient frankincense trail. And then that has a specific relationship to another location, Bountiful, as they turn east. The affliction occurring right as it should in the empty quarter. And then Bountiful in Arabia, right? Completely unknown at time, matching all required elements: ore, mountains, cliffs, fruit, honey, timber. We showed pictures of that. I've argued that no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences of the understanding of pre-Islamic Arabian geography. The Book of Mormon's description of geography and topography corresponds to an actual geography and topography in Mesoamerica. Right? This in and of itself is remarkable. Geological conditions required for the events in 3rd Nephi, we talked about those. Metals and gems we talked about. And then over 600 other mutually dependent correspondences. This counts as 600 different mutually, this is not 600 independent correspondences. It's not just, names that are unassociated, right? But they're mutually dependent by distances and topography. We argued that no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. The Book of Mormon's description of populations, literacy, and culture corresponding with Mesoamerican chronology and culture in at least the following. The Jaredite and Olmec overlap in time, depth, and geography in the area north of the proposed Nephite lands. Nephites and the Maya civilization overlapping in time, depth, and geography. And the fact that both of those were literate cultures. The remnants of the Olmec culture surviving and overlapping for the appropriate centuries with the Nephite cultures. We talked about the desire to elevate Nephi to king upon landing, reflecting the cultural trends discerned for Mesoamerican peoples of that time frame. We talked about Jacob's sermon, discussing the twin evils of costly apparel and polygamy, and how that fit into economic pressures that were beginning at that time and in the region. We talked about the movement of Quichean speakers into Kamina Hilyu, corresponding in time depth to the change in circumstances that lead to Mosiah fleeing the city of Nephi. We talked about the merger of Nephites and the people of Zarahemla, corresponding in time and place with the linguistic movement of the Zoque speakers, right, into the Grijalva River Valley. King Benjamin's denials corresponding with Mayan kingship, right? He says, I am not this, I am not that, known elements of Mayan kingship. The system of over-kingship and interstate visits corresponding with Mesoamerican political systems, the treatment of captives, the anti-Nephi Lehis and the cult of war, their blood being stained on their wooden swords, and how that made sense in the cult of war that they came from. The expedition that Limhi sends to find Zarahemla that gets lost, finds the wrong river, and finds remains right where they should have been. The use of cement and treelessness in the Teotihuacan area north of the Nephite lands at the correct time. The historical influence of that powerful city-state, providing the explanatory background for the changes that Mormon notes in both the nature of war and the destruction of the Nephites. We argue that no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. Despite the fact that Joseph Smith lived in the age of modern or technical warfare, the Book of Mormon consistently reflects basic patterns of pre-modern warfare as well as ancient Mesoamerican warfare. These pre-modern and Mesoamerican military patterns are not limited to generalities. We talked about even the minutest details of the text, from the causes of warfare, the agricultural economic base, the problems of supplying soldiers in the time of war, the seasonal patterns of war. We matched up all the seasons and when they went to battle. Military implications of geography and climate. We went through specific battles and showed why they would make sense in that particular geography. Limited use of animal resources. We went specifically into their armor and showed how they differed from the biblical writings on armor and how that matched Mesoamerican armor. Weapons technology and topography, and then we went in depth into fortifications as well. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. P. After publishing the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith claimed to reveal a part of the prophecy of Enoch. And then at least 22 themes and specifics. Joseph Smith's Enoch corresponds to Enochic literature not available to the world in 1830. So we specifically used Enochic literature, not Enoch 1, even though there's really no evidence yet Enoch 1. But we used especially the Book of the Giants from Qumran to show that he had no way he could access things. So the idea that Enoch is called a lad, the only time that word shows up in all of Joseph Smith's writing, it applies to Enoch, and we find that in these ancient documents. Enoch's call while occurring on a journey, the fact that he should open his mouth, divine protection, turning of the rivers, Gaborim equals the giants, wars and bloodshed, the secret oaths that are made, him being described as a wild man, again, very specific language that Joseph uses, never uses to anyone else in his writings and uses by Enoch. This unique name, both two textual variants that are preserved in Joseph's account and his role in asking questions of Enoch. Enoch's homeland being one of righteousness. The very idea that Enoch had a book of remembrance that he kept and he wrote in. Great fear coming upon his listeners, the fact that their children are conceived in sin. There's a hope for a better outcome. War. We talked about very specific, again, phrase, wild beast roar, and talking about the war that we find in both texts. Prison for the unrepentant, the fact that Enoch weeps, God weeps, and then Enoch is ultimately initiated into the heavenly council. We argue that no naturalistic explanation can account for these correspondences. Therefore, again, here's our inference. It's reasonable that Joseph Smith received revelation from a non-earthly source or God, as he claimed. It's the Enoch proposition. In 1842, Joseph Smith publishes portions of a Book of Abraham after coming in contact with the papyri and the Egyptian mummies. and at least the following the Book of Abraham's unique and again unknown in 1842 information about Abraham is corroborated by ancient texts. So we went through the very existence of a record written by Abraham. The Bible provides no hint that a Book of Abraham ever existed. Abraham's obvious literacy, when he's assumed by most scholars, he was assumed by most scholars to be an illiterate farmer or sheep herder. Obviously, Abraham's literacy is possession of ancient records, his desire to be one who possesses great knowledge, the rebellion of his fathers who once received the priesthood but turned to idol worship, the practice of human sacrifice. We talked about how this has just come into view in the last decade or so, including the sacrifice of children as being part of the local practice. Killing of people who refused to worship idols of wood and stone, the violent seizing of Abraham and of the local priest to slay him as a human sacrifice, the role of his father in getting him arrested and bound, seeking to have killed, his miraculous delivery by the power of God, and we talked about how an angel was involved in some texts as well. The repentance of his father, at least for a time, and then subsequent return to idolatry after the famine. His knowledge of stars, planets, astronomy, attained through revelation. The fact that he goes to Egypt to teach astronomy. Revelation to Abraham about the premortal existence of spirits or intelligence is in the presence of God, including information on great council. And the fact that Abraham is honored by kings or he's on a throne. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. In 1842, Joseph Smith introduces the endowment after his experience with Freemasonry. He claimed this endowment was ancient, specifically that it had been had by ancient patriarchs and by Jesus himself. We talked about evidence existing in ancient texts for the following specific endowment themes and discrete symbolic actions, images, or phrases. Right? So the fact that the tradition originates with Jesus, we traced it in documents down to Alexandria from apostles. The initiatory rituals being the center of Christ's gospel. Pre-existence of mankind and the creation drama being the center and the main drama of all temples. We talked about washing and anointing with oil specifically in corresponding to how Joseph said to do it with how it exists today even in Orthodox churches the same way. Ritual prayer circles, use of ritual clothing, hand clasps as tokens of recognition, hands in cupping shapes to receive gifts, sacred signs, tokens, keywords, including knowledge of the sacred name of God necessary for exaltation. Marriage being the complete ordinance, the last thing. The initiation rituals symbolizing a heavenly ascent, and then the veil separating the initiate from God, including the marks on the veil and the marks on garments, which we showed. No naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for these correspondences. So evidence from the Book of Mormon, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Abraham, and the endowment corroborating Joseph's claims do not have reasonable naturalistic explanations. Right? There's been, when you look at the criticism of the Book of Mormon, they'll talk about how he could have come up with the word Moroni. Right? No one has shown a naturalistic explanation for everything that we've presented. Much less Book of Enoch, Book of Abraham, on and on and on. Therefore, I would argue it's reasonable that Joseph received these texts information from a supernatural source as he claimed. If Joseph received these texts and information from a supernatural source as claimed, it is reasonable to believe his claims regarding the existence and origin of the metal plates. Right? That's the inference that has to be made from those arguments. Finally, in our last section, we went through circumstantial evidence from purported revealed doctrine. Again, requires inference. Joseph's revelations, supposed revelations, solve in many respects centuries-old philosophical and Christian-specific problems. They're consistent with the earliest forms of Christianity, provide guidance on the abiding anxieties of life, and in many cases, traditional theology is actually moving closer to his point of view in the last 200 years. So specifically, Joseph Smith's theology dissolves the question of nihilism and the threat of non-being. It resolves the paradox of creation created by classical theism. His theology of material, spirit, and body resolves the mind-body problem. We talked about how the belief in divine embodiment existed and persisted among the faithful followers of Christ from its earliest beginnings up through the 5th century AD. We even showed that riots occurred when they tried to change this doctrine, so that his idea of an embodied God restores the original Christian understanding. We talked about how he revealed a personal and passible feeling God that was drastically different from the then accepted God of Christianity. Now we find more than a century later that this view of God is now been reaccepted by virtually everyone in Christianity. The accepted view of virtually every scholar who's reviewed the evidence is that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo was a philosophical invention at the end of the 2nd century AD. So Joseph Smith's revealed theology of creation ex materia, creation out of matter or out of pre-existing matter, restores the original Christian and Jewish understanding of creation. By denying creation ex nihilo, Joseph Smith's theology obliterates the central Christological dispute, right? The difference between man's nature and God's nature that formed the central Christological dispute for centuries. Joseph Smith revealed a Godhead as a social trinity that was drastically different than the accepted trinity of Western Christianity. This view of the Trinity is the accepted pre-creedal view, right, and has now been reaccepted by thinkers representing every major Christian tradition. Not arguing every Christian, but thinkers within every major Christian tradition. Joseph Smith defined definition of perfect as unchanging in some respects, like love, and eternally self-surpassing in other respects, like creation and relationship creating. That this definition of perfection was radically different, right, than the immutable, unchanging God of classical theism. However, unknowingly, perhaps, in his defense in the 20th century, philosophers argued that this system is more intellectually rigorous and has more philosophical power than classical theism. Joseph Smith's theology speaks directly to the need that many Christians have for the development of the feminine image of God, right? It places the divine feminine on the same ontological footing as Heavenly Father. It requires man and woman for human deification as the most exalted view of the divine feminine that we find in theology anywhere. Joseph Smith claimed a real doctrine of deification that was met when he put it out there with calls of heresy, pantheism, and philosophical unsoundness. However, we talked about in the past 60 years, the early Christian doctrine of deification has been reaccepted again by every branch of Western Christianity. Joseph Smith was heavily criticized for rejecting a closed canon. However, in the last 50 years, scholars are arguing that it is difficult biblically and theologically to argue for a closed canon. His theology of postmortem evangelization and vicarious baptism for the dead dissolves the soteriological problem of evil, the problem of evil in salvation. We talked about how evidence from Joseph F. Smith's vision of the dead being remarkably consistent as a condensed amalgamation of the three versions of the descent of Christ. When Joseph Smith revealed postmortem evangelization, no Christian community at the time accepted it, and it had been dormant for more than 1,000 years. However, it is now agreed that the earliest Christians taught the idea, and within the last century, more and more biblical commentators are affirming that Christ did indeed go and preach to the disembodied spirits. There's evidence, both biblical and post-biblical, that some of the earliest Christians practiced vicarious baptisms for the dead. Joseph's theology dissolves the logical problem of evil, the most pervasive and powerful argument against the existence of a loving God. He gives us a God and allows Christians to worship and trust a God in full confidence that's doing everything he can, given the nature of things, to help us overcome evil. His revelations provide unique insight into the atonement, right? Unlike classical theism, God is not the source of the alienation. The problem that requires Jesus' sacrifice is inherent within each human soul, and therefore there is no other way. The atonement was absolutely necessary. The resolution of alienation requires our response to Jesus' free act of love. At least one Mormon concept of the atonement that we went through, right? Other Mormon concepts, but at least one is very similar to the earliest moral influence idea, with the important addition that understanding why the atonement is absolutely necessary. That being, it's not something outside, not something in the universe, but it's necessary because of the nature of intelligence. No naturalistic explanation can account for any one person's ability to produce these ideas. Furthermore, no naturalistic explanation can reasonably account for someone of Joseph's time, place, education, and life circumstances to produce these ideas. Therefore, I would argue it is reasonable that he received these as revelations as he claimed. If Joseph received these texts and information from a supernatural source as claimed, here's the inference: it is reasonable to believe his claims regarding the existence and origin of the metal plates. Therefore, in conclusion, it's reasonable. I would argue from all this evidence it is probable. Again, I can't get over, I've not heard naturalistic explanations for all of the things I just threw, A through, I think we had double K, that can account for this. So I would argue that it's probable, but again, our standard of proof was reasonableness, that Joseph Smith in fact possessed plates weighing between 40 and 60 pounds, of which the Book of Mormon is a functional translation as claimed. So when people ask, is your faith reasonable, right? That's what we started with. Is it reasonable? This is the argument that, yeah, it's reasonable. This is, and that's why I wanted to start with the positive case, because unless you start with this background, with this footing, the criticisms can seem large, when in fact, in my view, they are not. So, for example, if we go through Book of Mormon criticisms, which we did in the Book of Mormon, but we'll cover a bit again, you'll find naturalistic explanations for some things, like I said, in the Dime novel, there is this word Moroni, so we could have gotten the word Moroni. Well, show me the Dime novel that has 600 BC culture of Jerusalem, right? Show me naturalistic explanations for what actually happens in the text. Very similar to that positive case is the argument to absurdity. Harold Bloom, we talked about his view on Joseph Smith. I like his view, or to cite it. He's essentially a disinterested observer. He's atheistic. He's a non-practicing Jew. And it's very rare do you get someone studying Joseph Smith that doesn't have an axe to grind, pro or con. After his study, this is what he concluded. If one decides that Joseph Smith was no prophet, then one's dominant emotion towards him must be wonder. There is no other figure remotely like him in our entire national history, and it is unlikely that anyone like him ever can come again. And I would argue that that's right. If again, we've said it's reasonable that he's a prophet. So if you want to take the view that he's not a prophet, that's reasonable too. You're not, intellectualism, reason is not to the burden of proof where it's required of you intellectually, right? It's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's not a mathematical requirement of that level. But if he's not, right, what does he accomplish in his career? It's absolutely astounding, right? He starts off this young kid in the backwoods of New York, poor, and he says, I'm going to start a religion because I want either power or money or sexual conquest or whatever. Right? I'm gonna do this. So how does he do it? Well, he creates fake metal plates to start with. He says, I'm going to create a book of scripture. So he creates fake metal plates weighing between 40 and 60 pounds. He carves those with expert carvings. He has to dupe 22 natural witnesses that he allows to inspect these things. Now, he's got to be so confident in this fraud that he's perpetrating that he's going to allow these characters to be copied and actually want them to seek out the best scholars of his day. We talked about how those scholars weren't particularly good, and Charles Anthon wasn't a great scholar, but in his day they were the best they could find. So again, he's confident enough in his fraud that he's going to allow them to be copied and send them out to the best scholars. They are actually believed by those scholars, such as Mitchell and Anthon, right? Because if not, then we have Martin Harris as part of conspiracy. And if he's part of conspiracy, we have all these problems because there's no evidence he's part of conspiracy, and he's alienated from Joseph. We went through all of that in the Martin Harris. So we assume it dupes Anthon as Martin says. His metallurgical fraud is so convincing that all 8 formal natural witnesses believe it until death, despite their estrangement from Joseph and persecution for so saying. Now, then we get into these visionary stuff. Some people have pointed out that this could either be hypnosis. So we went through his apparent ability to induce hypnotic trance for Oliver and David, and then separately for Martin Harris, of these identical visions. Others have proposed that it's what's called second sight. So that would be hallucination. If it's hallucination, again, think about this. Joseph writes down that 3 people are going to have these hallucinations. And then he picks the 3 people that are able to have these complex hallucinations. So, again, extraordinarily lucky for him to pick the 3 right people to have these complex hallucinations. Again, they are complex. Audio, visual visions that are specific, experienced in the same manner, which is in contravention of known hypnotherapy. These also happen without his presence, which, again, extraordinarily lucky for Mary Whitmer, Zaire Pulsifer, Harrison Burgess, and at least Luke Johnson. These hypnotic trances happened prior to the rise of hypnotic research in a location in rural New York where there's no evidence that even knowledge existed. It's so effective for Martin, Oliver, and David, Mary, and others, it endures for the rest of their lives. right? Despite no relationship and ridicule, and much to gain, especially in the case of Oliver with losing political campaigns. Joseph Smith then induces vision of John the Baptist laying on hands, right? So that's touching he and Oliver, and then again for Peter, James, and John. A vision of Moses, Elias, Jesus, and for Oliver and he. Again, so Oliver's involved with lots of this stuff that he can potentially out him with. This hallucination is so effective for Oliver that it endures for decades, despite no relationship and large potential gains for denial. All right, now he's got through that first part of visions and fakeness, but now he's got to put something down. So he puts his head in a hat, and he uses the stones that he used to use to help people find lost things and hopefully buried treasure. And he dictates 588 pages of what we have as the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. He takes 63 days to do so. He starts mid-narrative in Mosiah, works to the end, right? Then finishes at the beginning of the current narrative, right? Because he dictated a portion which is lost, so now, he's got to just start from the middle and go around. Okay, so he's got to use no other sources, pick up without having read prior sections, and spell proper names. Right? Otherwise, we have this huge conspiracy because they have no evidence that he had other materials. We talked about all the evidence for his origin theory, or his origin story. So he covers more than 1,000 years of history. He names 200 individuals, 100 distinct places. He incorporates multiple genres from narration to inserted sermons, letters to scriptural commentary and poetry. He's quoting entire sections of Isaiah, right? It's complicated chronology, geography, and genealogy, yet remains internally consistent. Chronology is handled without glitches despite several flashbacks and temporally overlapping narratives. It keeps straight both the order and family connections among the 26 Nephite record keepers that he's making up and 41 Jaredite kings that he's making up, including the rival lines. He conjures up 15 non-biblical names. Good, he's got to make up a bunch of them. So here's 15 that are not in the Bible. But then they're now attested in ancient Hebrew scriptures, Hebrew inscriptions in the Boule that we showed. 14 of which are dating before 587 BC. Right? Then he makes up 4 names which turn out to be authentic Egyptian names. He's just, the luck is ongoing, right? He then makes up this story. Right? It's 508 pages, 60 days. He's got to go quickly, right? He's on a quick pace. But it's got to be consistent with the culture and situation in Jerusalem in 600 BC. There's no source material for the situation in 600 BC in Jerusalem. That I've never seen any proposed source material for any of the things that we talked about. Despite the Western world having no knowledge, and in fact contradictory knowledge about pre-Islamic Arabian geography and culture, right? We showed what, if he had source material, what he would have wrote about Arabia, and it was exact opposite. Joseph's story is consistent with later discoveries in all of the following ways, right? The Frankincense Trail, and Nahum, and Bountiful. Despite the world having no knowledge about pre-Columbian Mesoamerican geography, chronology, and culture, right? He's got to actually create something that fits. Lo and behold, it fits. We have 600 internally consistent geographical statements that match a real-world location, including specific stories, battles, Limhi's expedition with rivers. Pre-Columbian culture chronology matches time, death, and geography to actual societies that we find, literate societies, cultural trends, economic growth, everything that we went through in the Book of Mormon. Despite living in the modern age of warfare, and Joseph liked warfare, his version of it. He'd prance around on his horse Charlie in front of the Nauvoo Legion with this sword, right? Very romantic ideals, and yet we don't find those ideals in the Book of Mormon. We find ancient warfare, ancient Mesoamerican specific warfare. Then he turns and he says, great, I read about this Book of Enoch in the Bible, I'm going to produce a Book of Enoch, right? And he does. He conjures up a Book of Enoch. It just so happens that after that we find books of Enoch, and he matches those books of Enoch in these specific detailed themes and ways in the 22 that we went through. Then he buys the mummies. He's intrigued. And he says, well, I'm not done. I did a Book of Enoch. Now I'm going to do a Book of Abraham. And I'm going to, again, just conjure it. I'm going to make stuff up. And he does that. Specific details about his life. Those then have to be matched by ancient texts that we don't have then, that we find later. We went through all of these specific things that are matched in his Book of Abraham with ancient texts that we have now. Then he goes through Freemasonry. He says, great, I am going to continue the creation of this is my ultimate act, and I'm going to take Freemasonry and I'm going to splinter it and create my own thing. And so he says, but don't worry, the ancients had this and Jesus had this, and he gives the endowment. Well, then we have to find ancient texts that corroborate specific endowment themes, matching it to Jesus. Essentially, every unique aspect of the endowment we find in ancient texts. Finally, again, through all of this is documents, these made-up revelations and books of Scripture. He's got to weave into it this theology, right? This fairly unique theology that solves, in many respects, centuries-old philosophical and Christian-specific problems. It goes against the grain in almost every way from his surrounding culture and the Christian theology that was available to him. Yet, it has to be found to be consistent in most cases with earliest forms of Christianity and provide for millions now guidance on the abiding anxieties of life, right? I've talked about how, for me, this is all intellectually compelling, but what moves me are things like the problem of evil and the problem of atonement, which has affected my life and affect millions of people's lives. So he has to, as a charlatan, he's got to produce an actual theology. In many cases, traditional theology has to move closer to him over the next 200 years, right? And then we talked about him dissolving non-being and mind-body and on and on and on. I would argue that it's highly improbable that Joseph Smith could have accomplished B through O. Therefore, I would argue from an argument to improbability that it's that first proposition that he's a fraud through metallurgical fraud, massive gnosis, and made-up nonsense is false, that it's reasonable that he in fact possessed plates, translated those plates, and received revelation as he claimed. That is the argument from absurdity. And Bloom, when he was looking at it, was really only looking at his stuff on Enoch, and he was amazed of what he could do with Enoch, and he was also amazed by theosis. But he didn't go through everything. It's not even close to what I've gone through. But I think that's for those that don't want to say he's a prophet and find enough reasonable evidence to convince them he's not. Again, you got to be in awe of this guy and what he was able to accomplish before dying for it. So that's the close of the positive argument. We will go through now next the criticisms that people have of LDS Truth Claims. So we'll start with probably the most distinct, the most brought up thing, which is the fact that prophets get things wrong a lot, it turns out. So we'll go through the idea of fallibility and whether if there's these hidden inferences, right, that are in the critics' assumptions, and whether those are correct. Should we have the same assumptions that they do about prophets and how they work? We'll talk about gender roles, treatment of women and priesthood, marriage doctrine, age of earth and evolution. Blood atonement we'll put up here in prophets and fallibility, since it's in the idea of prophets saying weird stuff. A lot of the things that I initially had as criticisms, we ended up covering in the course of the positive case. So a lot of all of the Book of Mormon criticisms, except for, we covered the anachronisms, and those are the major criticisms. Other things are naturalistic ideas about how we could have got things. Again, nothing covering really what we covered. So I might take one day and just point people to where I covered it in the past so they know that I covered it. But I don't have it here because we ended up covering a lot of it. For example, theosis. We covered a lot of the criticisms of nature of God, atonement theory, a lot of criticism from the theology in the positive case. So it ended up being that way, but I may go through and just make sure that people know where it was covered so that there's not a claim that I skipped things. Then we'll go through historical issues. The first vision, his character, Joseph Smith's character, early years as money digging, legal issues. Polygamy is a sexual history, polygamy and polyandry, which is always a big one. We covered Book of Abraham, but again, I'll probably cover that. We covered temple and masonry, but I'll probably just make sure we'll go back and cover that. Kinderhook plates, prophecies, in some cases not coming true. We'll cover that. His martyrdom. Finally, historical issues with Brigham Young and his successors, and then cultural issues in the church. So the priesthood ban and racism, that'll go into prophets' infallibility, but we'll cover that. Mountain Meadows Massacre, Mark Hoffman scandal, use of money in the church, and the purpose of church. So the cultural situation found in the church.
Finally, this last presentation, number 34, covers a great topic of what church members have to believe. The presentation specifically is talking about this in regards to pushback from science, but I found this explanation very straightforward and enlightening.
Arguments that contain premises about what, quote, members must believe. Anytime you see an argument against LDS Truth Claims about, quote, what they must believe, are always false unless those assertions are covered in the Temple Recommend interview questions, which are as follows. Do you have faith in and a testimony of God, the Eternal Father, His Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost? Notice, does it talk about anything about our understanding of the Trinity here? We talked about different models of the Trinity, the social Trinity. We talked about modalism. We talked about tritheism.
No.
Are we ever asked, do you subscribe to a social model of the Trinity? No, right? Do you have faith in, right?
Yeah.
God seems far less concerned with the conceptual conceptions we have in our mind and far more concerned with our actions and our motivation. So, do you have a testimony of the atonement of Christ and His role as Savior and Redeemer? Notice, we talked about different theories of the atonement, right? We talked about theories that I think are crazy, and we talked about the moral satisfaction theory, all sorts of different theories. Are we ever asked, do you hold, right, to a particular theory of the atonement of Jesus Christ? We're not. You can believe whatever you want about how the atonement is efficacious as long as you feel that it's efficacious in your life. Do you have a testimony of the restoration of the gospel in these of the latter days? Notice, are you asked anything about, do you know that on June 12th the Melchizedek priesthood was restored? Because we debate the timing of when the Melchizedek priesthood was restored. We don't, right? Do you have a testimony of the restoration of the gospel? We don't even, the content of that is left to the member. The content of that is left between you and God. Do you sustain the President of the Church of Jesus Christ? We talked about different views of sustaining in our talk about infallibility. We talked about reasons for accepting LDS doctrine as authoritative in our life and how we deal with hard situations where we feel that things are wrong. We're asked if we sustain, but we're not given some definition of sustain. We're not even given a definition of prophecy and revelator. We talked about how we would define a prophet through the scriptures as someone that has authority but sometimes makes mistakes, and we talked about that definition. But we're not given a definition, right? That's up to you. What are the other ones? Do you live the law of chastity? Nothing about knowledge there. Anything in your conduct related to the members of your family? This is the closest you get. Do you support or affiliate with or agree with any group or individual whose teachings or practices are contrary to or oppose those accepted by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? This is the closest we get to some sort of doctrinal litmus test. You'll notice that those, and certainly there's been periods in our history when the church, the leaders of the church, have been less accepting of those that are pushing the bounds of intellectual curiosity and freedom. We've had mistakes made by fallible leaders that have excommunicated members wrongly. Abraham Gileadi, for example, is a prime example of that. One of the foremost scholars of Isaiah in the world. You should look him up and read his works on Isaiah, and also read his or watch some of his testimonies. Just unbelievable. Born in Holland, most of his life grew up. Born in Holland during World War II. His dad was like hiding members of the resistance in Holland. They moved to New Zealand, where he became very religious. Moved to Israel, where he lived in a kibbutz and actually converted to Judaism, found the Book of Mormon there in a kibbutz library, read it, knew it was true, but could never make contact with the church, lived another 3 years there, became a monk, did all this stuff, joined the church, was baptized in Israel, and got a PhD anyway. Just fascinating individual. But he was excommunicated as part of the September 6th. A group of kind of scholars and intellectual people that were excommunicated in 1991. He always felt that it was wrong, and for 10 years, but how he chose to deal with it was very interesting. He didn't blog, he didn't go denouncing people. He lived for 10 years, and when the church brought him back, they actually expunged his entire record, essentially admitting that it was incorrect, that he shouldn't have been excommunicated, and he's. So look, are mistakes made? Absolutely, mistakes are made. Fallible people. At times, are people less? Are they following Joseph Smith's mantra of dynamism and not being trammeled? Sometimes we do that, but as a whole, the goal, the standard Joseph sets is wide latitude in terms of our thought, in terms of what we think. So this is as close as we get. Other than that, keep the commandments, being honest, paying tithing, keeping the word of wisdom. But even that, right? You're not asked about it. You're not asked to. There's not some list of of groups do you belong to A through Z, right? You're just asked, and you have that discussion between you and your bishop, and it's based on what you think. Do you think that you affiliate or agree with a group that's opposed? Well, you should talk about it. But again, in terms of content, we stay away from it. There just isn't here. So we have word of wisdom, tithe payer, financial obligations, wearing of the garment, and do you consider yourself worthy? So what do we have to believe, right? And if any premise starts with members must believe X, right? We have to be very, very careful because there's very, very little that we have to believe.
Well, and this is a temple recommend. I mean, what percentage of members actually hold active recommends? Do you know what I'm saying? It's not like.
But this would be the height of creedalism, right? This will be the height of, in other words, if they're trying to prove to you, if a critic is saying you must believe this, and you say why must I believe that?
Right.
If you say what's the highest form of worship that I have? Well, it's going to the temple and worshiping in the temple. So to do that, I have to honestly answer 13 questions.
Okay.
None of them have to do with believing in a universal flood, no pre-Adamites, on and on, whatever they want to bring up, right? This is what they are,
Okay.
right? I don't have to have a certain theory of the Trinity, of the atonement, any of those things, right? So that's what I'm saying is that the content about what we must believe is actually very small. Now we're encouraged to have beliefs, we're encouraged to read scriptures, study, right? Do all those things, but we have the latitude, and that's what's so wonderful about the religion Joseph Smith founded.
Yeah, not having creeds is really huge because you don't have to believe in the concepts of men. You can connect right with God and say, what does the atonement mean for me? Whereas with the creed, it says you have to believe what this guy says, and if you disagree with him, then you're in jeopardy.
Yep. Yeah, you spend a lot of time, like I said, if we did that, we would get together, and I would argue passionately for my, moral satisfaction theory of the atonement, and others would argue, for their penal substitution, and the First Presidency would get in there, and we'd structure language about what the atonement means, right? That's what you do with the creeds. That's what they did with the Trinity. That's what they did with sin and with all sorts of things. So we don't do that. We stay away from doing that, and therefore it's left to you individually to believe and to read and to think and
Revelation.
Yeah, and on we go. So.
Okay.
So our conclusion is that arguments that contain premises about what members must believe are always false unless those assertions are covered in the Temple Recommend interview questions. So this includes Mr. Reynolds' assertions that members must believe in a global flood and that there is no death on earth prior to 7000 BC. Again, those were the two things that he said were among the many apparent beliefs of Latter-day Saints, which are that are absolutely contradicted by science. So. This idea again that our faith is easily dismissed by scientific inquiry, I think, is just patently absurd, and it doesn't take seriously hundreds of years of thought in our culture about the integration of science and religion, the debates that we've had internally about these issues of flood and evolution. And it doesn't really understand the religion at all. It doesn't understand the essence of it, which was what Joseph Smith said, that he accepted truth from whoever, and he welcomed scientific inquiry, and he didn't like to feel trammeled. So anyway, I find it, again, very difficult to believe that folks like this that have these questions have been sincere, because it's so easy to find all this material in terms of our debates.
So that was a lot, but if you thought it was interesting, I'd highly suggest going and working your way through some of the full presentations. They are very faithfully and thoroughly considered, and while there are some places of speculation that might not be as relevant, in my opinion, he did a good job communicating those things, and was very transparent and faith-promoting the entire time. As always, thanks, hope you enjoyed. And if you did, consider subscribing, or joining me on Odyssey or Rumble, both great YouTube alternatives. Links are in the description.